The moment she grabbed my prosthetic arm, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and even a strange sense of violation. It wasn't just an object to me. It was part of my body, something that helped me navigate the world. Yet here she was, treating it like a toy or some kind of curiosity to entertain her kids. Her casual attitude made it worse. She didn't seem to care that what she was doing was deeply disrespectful. Instead, she held it up, inspecting it as if it were a gadget from a science fiction movie. "This is so cool," she said with exaggerated enthusiasm, flexing the fingers of the prosthetic arm to make robotic noises. "Look, kids, it moves." Her children laughed, clapping their hands as though this was the most exciting thing they'd ever seen. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. This wasn't a museum exhibit or a demonstration. It was my life being turned into a sideshow for her amusement. "Stop it," I said sharply, my voice rising despite my attempt to stay calm. "That's not yours. Give it back." I reached out, trying to take it from her, but she pulled it away, holding it just out of reach. Her smug expression didn't falter. If anything, she looked amused by my reaction, as though I was overreacting to a harmless joke. "Oh, relax," she said, waving her free hand dismissively. "I'm not breaking it." See, to prove her point, she bent the elbow joint of the prosthetic, making more exaggerated sound effects. The crowd around us had grown larger now, people pausing mid-stride to watch the spectacle unfold. Some whispered to each other, while others openly stared. A few even chuckled, clearly entertained by the bizarre scene. My face burned with embarrassment. I hated being the center of attention, especially under circumstances like these. By now, I was furious. How could someone be so entitled? Who gave her the right to touch something so personal without asking? And why did she think it was okay to treat my disability like a prop? "I'm serious," I snapped, stepping closer. "Give it back right now, or I'm calling security." That got her attention. For a second, she hesitated, her confident facade slipping just slightly. But then she rolled her eyes dramatically, as if *I* was the unreasonable one. "Fine," she huffed, dropping the arm onto the sand like it was trash. "But maybe next time, you should be more considerate of other people's children." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. More considerate? Was she serious? I hadn't done anything wrong. All I'd done was sit quietly on the beach, minding my own business, when she decided to barge into my space and disrupt everything. The audacity of her comment left me speechless. I stood there, staring at her, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. She didn't stick around to hear my response. With a final glare, she turned on her heel and walked away, her kids trailing behind her. As she disappeared into the crowd, I sank back onto my towel, still reeling from what had just happened. My prosthetic arm lay in the sand where she dropped it, coated with grains of sand. Picking it up, I brushed it off carefully, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I wanted to cry, scream, or both. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. Losing control wouldn't solve anything, but inside, I was seething. As the initial shock began to wear off, I noticed the lingering stares from the people around me. Some looked sympathetic, shaking their heads disapprovingly at Karen's behavior. Others seemed unsure of how to react, glancing between me and the retreating figure of the woman. A couple of teenagers nearby exchanged awkward smiles before quickly looking away. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd stepped into some absurd alternate reality where basic human decency no longer existed. I tried to focus on calming down, reminding myself that this wasn't the first time I'd dealt with ignorance or insensitivity. Over the years, I'd encountered plenty of people who treated my prosthetic arm like a novelty item, a thing to gawk at or ask invasive questions about. But this was different. This wasn't just curiosity or thoughtlessness, it was outright entitlement. Karen hadn't just touched my arm. She'd taken ownership of it, acting as if she had every right to do whatever she pleased. It wasn't just rude, It was dehumanizing. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every glance, every whisper felt like judgment. Even the sound of children laughing in the distance made me tense, reminding me of Karen's kids giggling at their mom's antics. I tried to distract myself by reading a book or listening to music, but my mind kept replaying the incident over and over again. Why did people like her exist? What made her think she could treat others this way? And why did situations like this always seem to happen to me? The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. On one hand, I felt lighter, like the act of sharing my story online had lifted some of the weight off my shoulders. It was comforting to know that so many people understood how I felt and stood by my side. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the lingering frustration and vulnerability. The Reddit thread had validated my feelings, but it hadn't erased the reality of what happened. Karen's actions were still fresh in my mind, as vivid as if they'd occurred moments ago. As I sipped my coffee and stared out the window, I found myself thinking about visibility. Not just physical visibility, how my prosthetic arm makes me stand out, but emotional visibility too. How often do people like me get dismissed or treated as less than because of their differences? Society talks a lot about inclusion and acceptance, yet situations like mine prove that we're still far from where we need to be. For every person who empathizes, there's another who sees someone like me as an opportunity for entertainment or curiosity. And while I've grown used to navigating these moments, it doesn't make them hurt any less. That afternoon, I decided to visit a close friend, Mia. She's always been someone I could turn to when life felt overwhelming, and I knew she'd have something insightful to say about everything that had happened. Over cups of tea in her cozy living room, I recounted the entire incident, the entitled mom, her mocking tone, the way she treated my prosthetic arm like a toy, and even the mixed reactions I'd received online. As I spoke, Maya listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed deeply. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "what bothers me most isn't just her behavior. It's the fact that she probably won't think twice about it. People like her never do. They go through life assuming the world revolves around them, completely oblivious to the impact of their actions." Her words hit home. That was exactly what made this situation so infuriating. Karen wasn't malicious, at least not intentionally. She was clueless, self-absorbed, and unwilling to see beyond her own perspective, and maybe that's why her actions stung so much. If she'd been openly cruel or aggressive, I might have written her off as a bad person. But this casual disregard for my humanity, it was harder to process. After our conversation, I left Maya's house feeling slightly better, but still unsettled. On the drive home, I passed a park where kids were playing soccer, parents cheering them on from the sidelines. Watching them laugh and shout reminded me of Karen's children at the beach, their giggles as she flexed my prosthetic arm like it was part of a performance. Did they understand what was happening? Or did they simply follow her lead, mimicking her lack of respect without realizing it? It struck me then. Entitlement isn't just learned. It's taught. Children absorb the behaviors of the adults around them, whether good or bad. If Karen's kids grow up believing it's okay to treat others' belongings or bodies as public property, they'll carry that mindset into adulthood. And the cycle will continue unless someone steps in to break it. Sharing my story online felt like a small step in that direction, a way to plant seeds of awareness and encourage empathy. By evening, I sat down at my laptop again, scrolling through the Reddit thread one last time before calling it a night. The post had reached over 50,000 views now, with hundreds more comments pouring in. Some users shared personal anecdotes about similar encounters, while others offered advice on handling entitled individuals in the future. One comment particularly caught my eye. "Stories like yours remind us why representation matters. We need more voices like yours speaking up and educating others." Reading those words brought tears to my eyes. Not sad ones, but hopeful ones. Representation wasn't just about being seen. It was about creating change. Every time I shared my experience, I opened a door for someone else to learn, reflect, and grow. Maybe Karen herself would never change, but perhaps her children, or someone else reading my story, would think twice before treating another person's disability as a spectacle. As I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, I realized something important. Healing doesn't happen overnight. The anger, embarrassment, and frustration I'd felt wouldn't disappear completely anytime soon. But neither would the lessons I'd learned from this experience. I emerged stronger, not because I let Karen win, but because I refused to let her define me. And that realization gave me a quiet sense of peace, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I had the strength to face them head-on. The next day, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't that the anger or frustration had completely disappeared. They still lingered in the corners of my mind. But I felt a shift. Instead of focusing on what Karen had done, I began thinking about how I could use this experience to create something meaningful. Maybe it was time to stop letting moments like these define me, and start using them as fuel for change. I decided to return to the beach. Not because I wanted to confront Karen again, though part of me fantasized about giving her a piece of my mind, but because I refused to let her take away one of my favorite places. The beach had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of everyday life and reconnect with myself. If I avoided it now, she would have won, even if unintentionally. So, armed with determination, I packed my bag, grabbed my towel, and headed back to the shore. When I arrived, I chose a spot farther down the coastline, away from the area where the incident had occurred. The sun was shining brightly, casting golden reflections on the water, and the sound of waves crashing against the sand filled the air. For a while, I simply sat there, letting the rhythm of the ocean calm my nerves. It felt good to be back, to reclaim a space that meant so much to me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted her. Karen. She was sitting under an umbrella a few dozen yards away, her kids playing nearby. My stomach tightened instantly. Seeing her brought everything rushing back. The humiliation, the violation, the anger. For a moment, I debated leaving. Why put myself through this? What was the point of staying? And yet, something inside me pushed back against that instinct. Running away wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would reinforce the idea that people like her could dictate where I belonged. So instead of retreating, I stayed rooted in my spot. I spread out my towel, adjusted my sunglasses, and tried to focus on enjoying the day. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the fact that Karen kept glancing in my direction. Was she curious, guilty, or just annoyed that I'd returned? Part of me considered marching over to her and demanding an apology. How dare she act like nothing had happened? But deep down, I knew that confronting her wouldn't change anything. People like Karen rarely admit fault, especially when they don't believe they've done anything wrong. And besides, what would an apology even accomplish at this point? It wouldn't erase the memory of her actions or undo the way they made me feel. Instead, I chose a different approach: indifference. When Karen looked my way, I didn't glare or scowl. I smiled, a genuine, confident smile, and turned my attention back to the ocean. Let her wonder what I was thinking. Let her question whether I blamed her or forgave her. Either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd rattled me. As the hours passed, I found myself relaxing more and more. The initial tension melted away, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. This was my space, and no amount of entitlement or rudeness could take that away from me. By the time I packed up to leave, I felt lighter, freer than I had in days. Returning to the beach hadn't just been about proving a point. It was about reminding myself that I was stronger than any momentary setback. Later that evening, as I reflected on the day, I realized something important. Resilience isn't about never feeling hurt or angry. It's about finding ways to move forward despite those feelings. Life is full of Karens, people who will judge, disrespect, or dismiss you without a second thought. You can't control their actions, but you can control your response. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let them win. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a strange sense of gratitude, not for Karen, but for the lessons her behavior had taught me. She reminded me how far we still have to go in terms of empathy and understanding. Yes, but she also showed me my own strength. I wasn't just surviving these moments, I was learning from them, growing because of them. And that realization gave me hope, not just for myself, but for anyone else navigating a world that doesn't always see them clearly. The sun was shining brightly, and the beach was alive with the sound of crashing waves and laughing children. I had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Just me, my towel, and the soothing rhythm of the ocean. It's one of the few places where I can truly relax, away from the stress of everyday life. As soon as I found a quiet spot near the water, I spread out my towel and sat down, letting the warm sand sink beneath my fingers. My prosthetic arm rested beside me, gleaming slightly in the sunlight. To me, it's not just a piece of equipment. It's part of who I am, something that helps me live my life fully. I've always loved the beach because it feels like a place where no one judges you. People are usually too busy building sandcastles, chasing waves, or enjoying ice cream to pay much attention to anyone else. That's why I never expected anything unusual to happen today. Everything seemed normal at first. Families were scattered across the shore, kids splashing in the shallow water, and couples walking hand in hand along the edge of the tide. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed after a long week. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone heading toward me. At first glance, she looked like any other mom, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat, oversized sunglasses, and designer flip-flops. She had 2 kids trailing behind her, both giggling and kicking up sand as they ran ahead. They seemed harmless enough, so I didn't think twice about them. I went back to adjusting my things, making sure everything was comfortable for a lazy afternoon by the sea. That's when it happened. One of her kids, a little boy, probably around 7 years old, pointed straight at my prosthetic arm lying next to me. "Mommy, look," he shouted excitedly. "Is that a robot arm?" His voice carried over the noise of the beach, drawing a few curious glances from nearby sunbathers. For a moment, I froze. I've gotten used to questions about my arm, but there's always a pang of nervousness whenever strangers notice it. Still, I smiled politely, ready to explain if needed. What I wasn't prepared for was the mom's reaction. Instead of simply acknowledging her son's curiosity, or even apologizing for the interruption, she marched right up to me without hesitation. Before I could say a word, she reached down and grabbed my prosthetic arm as though it were nothing more than a discarded toy on the sand. My stomach dropped. The audacity of her actions left me speechless. How could someone just take something so personal without permission? "Excuse me." I finally managed to blur out, reaching for my arm instinctively, but she was already holding it up, inspecting it like it was some kind of novelty item. Her kids watched eagerly, clearly amused by their mom's antics. "This isn't a toy," I said firmly, trying to keep my tone calm despite the anger bubbling inside me. "That's my prosthetic arm." Her response: a smug smile and a dismissive shrug. "Well, you shouldn't leave it lying around if you don't want people touching it," she replied, as if *I* was the one causing trouble. Just like that, she turned what should have been a relaxing day into a scene straight out of a nightmare. By the time Karen finally walked away, I was shaking, not just from anger, but from a deep sense of frustration that had been building inside me for years. It wasn't just about today or her actions. It was about all the times before this when people had treated my prosthetic arm like it was something less than human, like it wasn't part of me. Her smug attitude, her refusal to see how wrong she was, it felt like a punch to the gut. But what made it worse was the realization that no matter how much I explained or argued, people like her would never truly understand. As I sat there on the sand, staring at my prosthetic arm now coated with grains of sand, I couldn't help but replay the scene in my mind. Every word she said, every laugh from her kids, it echoed in my head like a broken record. I wanted to scream, to let out all the emotions bubbling inside me. But instead, I took a deep breath and tried to focus. Losing control wouldn't fix anything. What I needed was clarity. And maybe, just maybe, sharing my story could help someone else feel less alone. That evening, after packing up my things and leaving the beach earlier than planned, I went home and opened my laptop. My hands were still trembling slightly as I typed out a post for Reddit's entitled People Forum. I titled it, **** insane. Karen mom pulls out my prosthetic arm at the beach, claims it's a toy. ***, as I wrote, the words poured out of me, raw and unfiltered. I described everything. How she grabbed my arm without asking, how she mocked it in front of her kids, how she refused to apologize even when confronted. By the time I hit post, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because I'd finally put my thoughts into words, and anxiety because I didn't know how others would react. Within minutes, the comments started pouring in. At first, I braced myself for criticism. After all, the internet can be brutal, and I half expected someone to accuse me of overreacting or exaggerating. But to my surprise, most of the responses were supportive. People called Karen every name under the sun, entitled, "Clueless, a walking disaster." They shared their outrage on my behalf, validating my feelings in a way that made me feel seen for the first time in hours. One user wrote, "This is absolutely disgusting behavior. She had no right to touch your arm, let alone treat it like a toy." Another added, "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. No one deserves to be humiliated like that." Reading these messages brought tears to my eyes. Not sad tears, but grateful ones. For once, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. These strangers understood exactly how I felt, and their support meant more to me than they could ever know. But not all the comments were kind. Buried among the supportive messages were a few that stung deeply. One person wrote, "If she hadn't left it lying around, none of this would have happened." Another chimed in, "Maybe you should have handled it better. Escalating things only makes it worse." Their words cut through me like knives, not because they were true, but because they reminded me of the harsh reality I already knew. Some people will always find a way to blame the victim. Still, the overwhelming majority of the responses were positive, and reading them gave me strength. Many users shared their own stories of dealing with similar situations, strangers touching their wheelchairs, asking invasive questions about their disabilities, or treating them like objects of curiosity. One woman recounted how a man once tried to pick up her cane while she was using it, saying he thought it was decorative. Another talked about being scolded by a store employee for using a motorized cart at the grocery store, even though she needed it due to chronic pain. These stories resonated with me deeply, reminding me that I wasn't alone in feeling frustrated and disrespected. As the thread gained traction, it became clear that my experience struck a chord with many people. Some offered advice on how to handle entitled individuals in the future. Next time, record it on your phone, while others simply expressed solidarity. One commenter summed it up perfectly. "You deserve respect, plain and simple. Anyone who thinks otherwise is the problem, not you." By the end of the night, the post had hundreds of upvotes and dozens of replies. While I appreciated the outpouring of support, I also realized something important. Sharing my story wasn't just about venting. It was about raising awareness. Disabilities are often misunderstood, and incidents like this highlight the need for greater empathy and education. If my post could help even one person think twice before treating someone else's disability as a novelty, then maybe all of this pain would have been worth it. Still, as I closed my laptop and climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the lingering frustration. The internet might have rallied behind me, but real-life encounters with people like Karen were far harder to resolve. How do you explain to someone that their actions are hurtful when they refuse to listen? How do you protect yourself from ignorance when it feels like it's everywhere? These questions swirled in my mind as I drifted off to sleep, leaving me restless and uneasy. The next morning, I woke up determined to reclaim my peace. I decided that no matter how difficult or uncomfortable these situations might be, I wouldn't let them define me. Because at the end of the day, I am more than my prosthetic arm. And no amount of entitlement or disrespect could ever change that. The next morning, I woke up feeling heavy, like the weight of Karen's actions, and the emotional toll of reliving them online had settled into my chest. It wasn't just the incident itself that bothered me. It was the ripple effect it created. The stares, the whispers, the judgment, it all lingered in my mind, replaying over and over again, like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. Even though I knew logically that her behavior said more about her than it did about me, it still felt personal. How could it not? She had treated something so integral to my identity as if it were nothing more than a plaything. I spent most of the day trying to distract myself. I cleaned the house, reorganized my closet, and even attempted to bake cookies, something I hadn't done in months. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to the beach. What could I have done differently? Should I have confronted her sooner? Or maybe I should have ignored her entirely and walked away. The what-ifs swirled endlessly in my head, each one pulling me deeper into frustration. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk around my neighborhood. Fresh air always helped clear my mind, and I figured some movement might shake off the lingering tension. As I strolled down the quiet streets, I noticed people going about their lives, walking their dogs, chatting on front porches, tending to gardens. It was comforting, in a way, to see how normalcy carried on despite everything. Still, every glance from a passerby made me hyper-aware of my prosthetic arm. Was I imagining things, or were they staring? Was I reading too much into harmless looks, or had the incident at the beach made me overly sensitive? When I returned home, I checked the Reddit thread again. It had exploded overnight, with hundreds of new comments and thousands of views. Some users had even shared memes mocking Karen's behavior, turning her into an internet villain. While part of me appreciated the humor, another part felt uneasy. Reducing someone to a punchline didn't sit right with me, even if they deserved it. At the same time, I couldn't deny how cathartic it was to see others rally behind me, validating my feelings and calling out her entitled behavior. Among the chaos of the thread, one comment stood out. A user named Lifeguard Joe wrote, "As someone who works at beaches, let me tell you, entitlement runs rampant in places like this. People think rules don't apply to them, whether it's parking illegally or disrespecting others' boundaries. Don't let her ruin your love for the beach." His words resonated with me deeply. He was right. Karen wasn't unique. She was just another example of the kind of person who prioritized their own convenience or curiosity over basic human decency. And while that realization didn't make her actions hurt any less, it reminded me that her behavior wasn't a reflection of me. It was a reflection of her. Still, as supportive as the Reddit community was, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind. What about the people who didn't understand? The ones who thought I was overreacting or being too sensitive? Their opinions mattered too, in a way, because they represented a larger societal issue. For every person who sided with me, there was someone else who would side with Karen, dismissing my feelings as exaggerated or unnecessary. That divide, the gap between empathy and ignorance, felt insurmountable sometimes. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I found myself reflecting on why moments like these affected me so deeply. It wasn't just about Karen or the beach. It was about the constant battle of navigating a world that often doesn't accommodate differences, whether it's strangers touching my prosthetic without permission, asking invasive questions, or making assumptions about my abilities. I'm constantly reminded that I'm seen as other. And while I've learned to live with it, to adapt and push forward, it doesn't mean it doesn't wear on me. But amidst all the frustration, I realized something important. I wasn't powerless. Yes, I couldn't control how others behaved, But I could control how I responded. I could choose to let incidents like this define me, or I could rise above them. I could use my voice to educate, to share my experiences, and to advocate for change. Maybe one day, stories like mine wouldn't be met with disbelief or blame. They'd be understood as examples of why respect and empathy are so crucial. By the time sleep finally claimed me, I felt a flicker of resolve. Karen's actions had shaken me, no doubt about it, but they hadn't broken me. If anything, they'd reminded me of the importance of standing firm in who I am. Because at the end of the day, my worth isn't determined by someone else's ignorance. It's defined by how I carry myself, how I treat others, and how I refuse to let negativity dim my light. The next morning, I woke up feeling different, lighter. Not because the incident with Karen had faded from my memory. It still lingered like a scar you can't help but notice, but because I'd finally found a way to make peace with it. Over the past few days, I'd cycled through every emotion imaginable: anger, frustration, embarrassment, and even moments of doubt. But now, sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee in hand, I felt something new: clarity. Karen's actions weren't about me. They were about her. Her entitlement, her lack of empathy, her inability to see beyond her own perspective. And while that didn't excuse what she'd done, it helped me let go of the weight I'd been carrying. I realized that holding on to resentment wouldn't change her or protect me. It would only keep me stuck in a cycle of negativity. Letting go wasn't just an act of self-care, it was an act of power. That afternoon, I decided to take another walk along the beach. This time, I didn't hesitate when choosing where to sit. I picked the exact spot where the confrontation had happened, almost as if to reclaim it. The sand felt warm beneath my feet, and the salty breeze carried the faint scent of seaweed. As I settled onto my towel, I placed my prosthetic arm beside me without a second thought. It wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was part of who I am, and I refused to hide it for anyone. For the first time in days, I felt truly present. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, seagulls cried overhead, and children laughed as they chased each other near the water's edge. Life moved forward, unbothered by the drama that had unfolded here just days before. Watching it all, I couldn't help but smile. The beach wasn't Karen's domain. It belonged to everyone, including me. As I sat there soaking in the moment, I noticed a young boy staring at me curiously. He looked about 6 years old, with sandy blonde hair and wide eyes full of wonder. For a split second, I tensed, bracing myself for another uncomfortable encounter. But then his mother approached cautiously, kneeling beside him to whisper something in his ear. Instead of walking away, though, she stepped forward and smiled warmly at me. "I'm sorry if he was staring," she said softly. "He's never seen a prosthetic arm before, and he's really curious. Is it okay if we ask a couple of questions?" Her tone was polite, respectful, so different from Karen's dismissive attitude. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course," I replied, offering her son a reassuring smile. "What do you want to know?" His face lit up as he asked me how my arm worked, whether it could pick things up, and if it ever ran out of batteries. His questions were innocent, genuine, and free of judgment. As I answered them patiently, I saw his fascination transform into admiration. By the end of our conversation, he was grinning ear to ear, thanking me before running back to join his friends. Watching him leave, I felt a surge of hope. Not everyone would react the way Karen did. Some people genuinely wanted to learn, to understand. And maybe, just maybe, those small interactions could plant seeds of empathy that would grow over time. If sharing my story, even in tiny, everyday moments like this, could help someone see disabilities differently, then all of this pain would have been worth it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I packed up my things and headed home. The beach felt peaceful again, untainted by the ugliness of the past week. As I walked away, I glanced back one last time, taking in the beauty of the shoreline. This place hadn't changed. but I had. I'd faced something difficult and come out stronger on the other side. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on everything that had happened. Karen's actions had shaken me, no doubt about it. But they'd also reminded me of my resilience, my ability to rise above negativity and find meaning in adversity. More importantly, they'd shown me the importance of visibility, not just for myself, but for others who might feel invisible or misunderstood. In the end, I realized something profound. Life is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes downright unfair. People will say and do hurtful things, whether intentionally or not. But none of that defines us. What defines us is how we respond, how we choose to move forward despite the challenges. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to handle it. Because at the end of the day, I am more than my prosthetic arm. I am more than Karen's ignorance. I am resilient, courageous, and unapologetically myself. And nothing, not even the worst day at the beach, can take that away from me.